Tease me with that look again, the Mafia boss warned. She thought he was just another hot guest. Lyra had seen them all, the rich, the powerful, the influential. They passed through the hotel like shadows, their faces always half turned away, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, their smiles tight and controlled. The hotel was known for its exclusivity, where only the wealthiest or most dangerous of men and women came to escape their worlds for a night of luxury. But for Lyra, it was just another day at work. She was the concierge, a quiet observer to the lives of those who came and went, their secrets whispered behind closed doors. But then he walked in. Valerio De Luca was not just any guest. He was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke, whose gaze could freeze anyone in their tracks. He was the Mafia boss, feared by many, admired by few, and envied by all. When he entered the lobby, every head turned, every eye followed, and the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an invisible power that radiated from him. His black suit fit him perfectly, a sharp contrast to the soft lighting of the grand chandelier overhead. But it wasn't just the suit, it was the way he carried himself, like a lion surveying his domain. Lyra, standing behind the front desk, felt the shift in the room the moment he crossed the threshold. She had dealt with men like him before, men who thought their money and power made them untouchable. But there was something different about Valerio. Something about him that made her feel as though the rules didn't apply, even to someone like her. She tried not to look at him, keeping her focus on the paperwork in front of her, but she could feel his eyes on her. It was almost like a magnet pulling her in, forcing her to acknowledge him. When she finally looked up, his gaze was steady, piercing. "Good evening, miss," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for someone who could easily break a man with just a word. "I need a room for the night." Lyra nodded, her hands working mechanically to find the reservation. His voice sent a ripple through her, like a whisper in the quiet of a storm. She had seen many powerful men before, but there was something in his tone, something that suggested he wasn't just another guest. There was an edge to him, a darkness that made her pulse quicken, even as she tried to remain neutral. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, his lips curling slightly at the corners, as though he knew something she didn't. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "there's something about you." Something interesting. Lyra didn't respond, just continued her task, her fingers brushing over the keys of the computer. She could feel the weight of his attention on her, pressing down like 1,000 unspoken words. "Tell me," he continued, his voice dropping just low enough that only she could hear, "do you often stare at your guests like that?" Lyra's eyes flickered up at him again, her lips parting in surprise. He wasn't just a guest. He was testing her, seeing if she would flinch, if she would let her guard down. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice calm, steady. Valerio chuckled softly, a low, knowing sound. "Of course you don't." There was a pause, and for a moment it felt as if the entire room had fallen away. The distant chatter, the clinking of glasses from the bar, it all faded into the background as Valerio took a step closer. "I'll be staying for a few days," he added, his gaze still on her. "I hope you can accommodate me." Lyra didn't respond immediately, and she found herself wishing he hadn't said that. His words carried a weight, a meaning she couldn't quite place. It was a warning, yes, but it was also an invitation. She was a professional, trained to keep her emotions in check, to keep her distance from the men who walked through the hotel's grand doors. But there was something about this man, something that made her want to step closer to the line, just to see if it would be crossed. "Of course," she said finally, after what felt like an eternity. "Your room is ready." Valerio gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a smirk curling at the edges of his mouth.
"I'll be expecting you later, miss. Don't keep me waiting too long."
He turned then, walking away with a smoothness that only someone with such power could possess. Lyra stood still for a moment, staring after him, her heart beating just a little too fast. She could feel the heat of his words, still hanging in the air like a promise. What was it about him? What was it that had her thinking of him long after he had disappeared into the elevator? Later that evening, Lyra found herself doing the rounds of the hotel, checking in on the guests, making sure everything was running smoothly. But as she passed by the bar, she couldn't help but notice him again. Valerio was seated at one of the corner tables, his back to the wall, watching the room with an air of detached interest. There were a few other guests around, but he paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the space in front of him. And, Lyra realized with a start, on her. She tried to ignore the way her heart skipped at the sight of him, the way her breath caught in her throat as their eyes met across the room. He raised a brow, his lips twitching into that same small smirk. It was like a game between them, one he was determined to win, and one that she wasn't sure she was ready to lose. She forced herself to look away, focusing on the task at hand. But she couldn't stop thinking about the warning he'd given her earlier. "Tease me with that look again," he had said, as though it was something he would gladly accept. She couldn't help but wonder, was that what it was? A game? Was that all he wanted from her? The thought unsettled her, but at the same time, it ignited a spark of curiosity. As the evening wore on, Lyra felt an increasing pull toward him, despite herself. There was something about the way he carried himself, so sure, so confident, that made her want to unravel the mystery that was Valerio De Luca. She tried to focus on her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to him, to the dark power that seemed to surround him. It wasn't long before the bell rang at the front desk, and she found herself face to face with him again. He stood there, casually leaning against the counter, his eyes gleaming. "You were looking at me again," he said, his voice low and teasing. "I warned you." Lyra swallowed, her throat dry. There was no denying it now. She had been caught in his web, whether she liked it or not. "I didn't mean to," she said, trying to remain professional, trying to maintain control. Valeria's gaze softened, just for a moment, before his smirk returned. "You don't need to apologize. I find it interesting." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt the weight of his words again, a promise and a threat wrapped into one. And for the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't sure she wanted to run away from it. Lyra's world felt off-kilter after her encounter with Valerio. Every time she thought of him, the tension between them seemed to resurface, like an invisible thread pulling her toward him. She tried to focus on her responsibilities at the hotel, to keep herself busy. But something in her couldn't shake the image of his eyes watching her, so steady and full of quiet power. Over the next few days, Valerio made his presence felt. He appeared at all hours, sometimes in the lobby, sometimes at the bar. His presence always noticeable, always commanding attention without ever demanding it. Each time their eyes met, a flicker of something passed between them, something unspoken, something dangerous. Lyra tried to keep her distance, but every time he smiled at her or caught her glancing in his direction, it became harder to ignore the growing attraction. She couldn't help it. There was something about him, something that pulled her in. He wasn't just any guest. There was an air of darkness around him, a mystery she couldn't ignore. But she wasn't foolish. She knew better than to get too close to someone like him. Mafia bosses were not men to be trusted. They played a game where rules didn't apply, and where you risked everything by just being near them. One evening, Lyra was making her rounds through the hotel when she spotted Valerio sitting at his usual table in the far corner of the bar. His eyes were fixed on a glass of whiskey, but when she walked in, he looked up. Meeting her gaze across the room, she felt a flutter in her chest, an unexpected rush that she quickly pushed aside. She couldn't let him affect her like this. Her feet carried her past the bar, but before she could escape the pull of his gaze, Valerio's voice stopped her. "Miss Lyra," he called, his tone smooth and inviting, though there was an edge to it. "Come sit with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command, and yet there was something in his voice that made it feel more like an invitation to something dangerous, something tempting.
Lyra hesitated.
Her instincts told her to decline, to walk away and pretend like she hadn't heard him. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something almost welcoming. She turned around slowly, forcing a polite smile to her face, and approached him. As she sat down across from him, she couldn't ignore the electric charge in the air, the undeniable tension that surrounded them. "You don't come here often," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But I've noticed you, Miss Lyra, more than once." Lyra felt a flicker of unease, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. DeLuca," she said softly, trying to keep the conversation professional, even though she could feel the weight of his gaze. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart skip. "Of course. And you do it well. But you're more than just a concierge, aren't you?" Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but the way he spoke made it sound like he knew more about her than she was comfortable with.
"I'm just doing my job," she repeated, her voice firmer this time.
Valerio leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as if studying her. "Yes," he said, his tone softening. "But even in your job, you've managed to capture my attention. There's something about you, Miss Lyra. Something interesting." His words lingered in the air between them, heavy and loaded. Lyra could feel the tension building, could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as she tried to hold her ground. She didn't want to play his game, didn't want to be another face in his world of power and manipulation. But somehow she found herself drawn to him, despite all her better judgment. "I don't think I'm anything special," Lyra said, lowering her gaze to the table. She didn't want him to see the uncertainty in her eyes, the conflict that was starting to stir within her. "You're special enough to get under my skin," he replied, his voice tinged with something darker now. "Most people never get that chance." Lyra's heart beat faster, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "I think you're reading too much into it." Valerio's lips curled into a small smile. "Maybe. But I've never been one to shy away from the truth, Miss Lyra. I can see it in your eyes." "You're curious?" His words sent a shiver down her spine, but she refused to let him see how much his presence affected her. She wasn't going to fall for him. She wasn't going to be just another distraction for someone like him. "I don't have time for curiosity," she said firmly, standing up. "I'm here to work, Mr. Call. DeLuca." But Valerio didn't let her go that easily. He reached out and gently touched her wrist, a subtle gesture, but enough to stop her in her tracks. "I think you'll find that curiosity has a way of catching up with you," he said softly, his eyes locking with hers. "You may not want to admit it, but you're already curious about me. Just like I'm curious about you." Lyra's breath caught in her throat at the intensity of his gaze. She could feel the pull, that dangerous magnetic force between them, but she forced herself to step back. "I'll see you around, Mr. DeLuca," she said, her voice almost a whisper, before turning and walking away. Over the next few days, Lyra tried her best to avoid Valerio. Every time he came near her, it felt like the air around her crackled with energy. She could no longer pretend that their interactions were innocent. She was aware of the way he watched her, of the way his gaze seemed to follow her everywhere. And each time, the weight of it made her feel as if she were standing on the edge of something she couldn't control. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always another encounter waiting. Another moment where their paths crossed, and the pull between them grew stronger. One evening, as Lyra was leaving her shift, she nearly collided with Valerio in the hotel hallway. "Miss Lyra," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "You're leaving?" She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to ignore the heat that was rushing to her cheeks. "Yes, my shift is over." "I see." His gaze softened, and for a moment, he looked almost sincere. "I was hoping you'd join me for dinner tonight." Lyra hesitated. She knew what he was asking. She knew the kind of game he played. But for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to say no. There was something about him, something irresistible. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she said, her voice a little shaky despite her best efforts. Valerio's eyes flickered with amusement. "I think you'll find that you don't have a choice. I'm quite good at making people accept what they didn't want in the first place." Lyra took a deep breath. She was already in too deep, and she knew it. But for some reason, she couldn't walk away. "All right," she said finally. "I'll join you." Valerio's smile widened, but it wasn't the charming, pleasant smile he usually wore. This one was different, more like a victory. "Good," he said, taking a step closer. "I'll pick you up at 8. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Lyra standing there, her heart racing in her chest, unsure of what she had just agreed to. Lyra had never expected to be caught in the tangled web that Valerio De Luca wove so effortlessly. It had started as a simple professional encounter, a moment of strange curiosity, but now it was something more. Every encounter left her with a mixture of confusion and anticipation, emotions she tried hard to suppress. She had spent her entire life keeping her distance from dangerous men like him, and now she couldn't even find a way to walk away. The pull was too strong. It had been 3 days since Valerio had invited her to dinner, and Lyra found herself thinking about that moment far too often. She had tried to pretend it was just a casual invitation, nothing more than an evening with a hotel guest. But it wasn't. The way he looked at her, the words he had said, it was clear that he had other intentions. He was not like the others. There was a dangerous quality to him, a part of him that wasn't just about charm or power. It was something deeper, something that seemed to bind them together in ways Lyra couldn't understand. The evening had arrived, and Lyra stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress she had chosen for the occasion. It wasn't too much, just something elegant and understated. She had always believed that less was more when it came to dressing for professional events, but this was different. This wasn't work. This wasn't just another hotel function. This was dinner with Valerio De Luca, the Mafia boss who made everything seem dangerous, even something as mundane as a meal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Lyra took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter in her chest. She had known this moment would come, but she hadn't realized how much it would affect her until now. She opened the door to find Valerio standing in the hallway, his dark suit sharp against the dim lighting of the corridor. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes made Lyra's heart skip a beat. "You look stunning," he said, his voice low, his gaze taking in her appearance. There was something about the way he spoke that made her feel as though she were the only person in the room, as if the world had disappeared around them.
Thank you, Lyra replied, trying to keep her voice steady, but she couldn't help the blush that crept up her neck.
Valerio smiled, that knowing smile that made her wonder if he saw right through her. "Shall we?" he asked, offering her his arm. Lyra hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, taking his arm. She could feel the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her dress, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if he could feel her pulse racing. She quickly dismissed the thought. This was just dinner, after all. They made their way down the hallway to the elevator, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Lyra was used to silence, but this felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of something else, anticipation. She could sense that Valerio was waiting for something, waiting for her to say something, or perhaps to act in a way he expected, but she wasn't sure what he wanted from her. Was it really just dinner, or was there more to this invitation? When the elevator doors opened, Valerio led her inside, his hand brushing lightly against hers as they stepped in. He pressed the button for the top floor and the elevator began its ascent. The hum of the machine was the only sound as they moved upward. Lyra glanced at Valerio, wondering what he was thinking. His gaze was distant, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. She had seen him with other people, his clients, his associates, but with her he was different. She couldn't tell if it was the power he held or if it was something else entirely, but it was enough to make her feel both drawn to him and afraid at the same time. When they reached the top floor, Valerio escorted her out of the elevator and down the hallway to a private dining room. The door opened, revealing a small, intimate space with a grand view of the city below. The table was set for two, and the soft glow of candlelight flickered in the dim room, casting a warm, inviting glow on everything. "You have a beautiful view," Lyra remarked, her voice soft as she looked out the window. Valerio followed her gaze, but his expression remained unreadable. "Yes, the city looks different from up here. Quiet. Controlled." His words were deliberate, as if he were saying something more than what was on the surface. Lyra turned away from the window, catching his gaze once again. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" she said, trying to change the subject. She didn't know why she felt the need to fill the silence between them, but she did. Valerio didn't respond immediately. He moved to the table, pulling out her chair with a fluid motion before sitting down across from her. His eyes never left hers as he waited for her to sit. When she did, he poured wine into her glass, his movements slow, deliberate. "You're not like the others," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight she hadn't expected. Lyra frowned, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if he were trying to figure her out. "You don't play the game like they do," he said softly, his voice tinged with something almost admiring. "Most people pretend, act like they're just another face in the crowd. But you're different."
Lyra wasn't sure if she liked the way he said that.
It felt like an observation, but it also felt like an accusation, as though he was trying to find something in her that wasn't there. She tried to keep her expression neutral, though she could feel the warmth spreading across her face. "I'm not here to play games," she said, her voice steady though her heart was racing. "I just came for dinner." Valeria's smile was slow, deliberate.
Of course. Just dinner.
They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft clink of silverware against plates and the distant hum of the city below. Lyra tried to keep her mind focused on the meal, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Valerio. Every glance, every word he said felt loaded with meaning, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever he was planning. When the meal was finished, Valerio sat back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and intense. "You're not like the others," he repeated, his voice low. "And I think that's why I find you so intriguing." Lyra didn't know how to respond. She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she wasn't sure what he was asking. What did he want from her? "I'm not interested in whatever game you think we're playing," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't want to be part of your world." Valerio didn't look angry. He didn't seem offended either. Instead, he simply smiled. That same knowing smile. "You already are, Miss Lyra," he said softly. "You just don't know it yet." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as Valerio's fingers lingered on her arm, his touch both gentle and commanding. She tried to pull away, but his hand remained there. Not tight, but firm enough to stop her from leaving. The tension between them was palpable, thick with unsaid words, heavy with an unspoken promise that made her both nervous and curious. She had spent so many days trying to keep her distance, trying to pretend that this attraction, this undeniable pull toward him, was just a fleeting moment. But the reality was different. And now, standing in front of him, she realized just how deeply she had already been pulled into his world. "I'm not done with you yet," Valerio had said. His voice had been a whisper, but it had felt like a promise, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. The way he spoke, so calm, so sure of himself, it made her uneasy. She had known men like him before, men who wielded power like a weapon. But Valerio was different. There was something about him that made her wonder if she was more than just another fleeting interest for him. "What do you mean?" Lyra asked, her voice almost a whisper as she turned to face him fully. The question had been on the tip of her tongue ever since their dinner, and now finally it was out. Valerio's eyes held hers, dark and unreadable, as if he were searching for something in her, something that would tell him if she was truly ready for what he had to offer, or what he might take from her. "You've caught my attention, Miss Lyra," he said softly, "and when I find someone interesting, I don't let go." Lyra took a step back, pulling herself free from his grasp. She tried to steady her breath, but her chest still felt tight. "I told you before," she said, trying to hold her ground. "I'm not interested in whatever game you're playing." Valerio didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her with a look that was both unsettling and captivating. For a moment, she thought he might laugh, might dismiss her words with some charming remark, but he didn't. He stood still, his presence a constant force in the room. "You're already part of it, whether you want to be or not," he said, his voice steady but with a trace of something deeper. "You've been drawn into my world from the moment you met me, Miss Lyra, and now you have to decide if you're going to fight it or embrace it." Lyra could feel the weight of his words pressing on her. She had always kept a distance from men like him, Men who seemed to live in a world beyond her reach, a world where power and influence were the only rules. She had always been careful, always held on to the belief that she could remain unaffected. But Valerio had shaken that belief. He had made her question everything. "I don't want this," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "I don't want to be part of your world." Valerio's expression softened, but only for a moment. Then, just as quickly, it hardened again. "It's too late for that," he said, his voice low and quiet. "You're already in it, whether you admit it or not." Lyra felt a shiver run down her spine at the way he said it. It wasn't a threat, not really, but there was an edge to his words that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. And yet, part of her didn't want to turn away. "I don't belong in your world," Lyra repeated, though her voice wasn't as sure as before. "I'm not like them, I'm not like you." For the first time, Valerio smiled, but it wasn't the confident smile he usually wore. This one was softer, almost understanding. "No, you're not like them," he agreed, his tone gentle. "But you're not as different as you think, Miss Lyra. You're strong, independent. You think you can walk away from this, but you can't. Not now, not after everything that's happened." Lyra's heart raced as his words sank in. She didn't know what he meant by everything that's happened, but the way he said it made her feel like there was something more at play than just dinner or a few chance encounters in the hotel. He had been watching her, studying her, from the moment they met. And now she realized she had unknowingly stepped into a world she had no idea how to escape from. Valerio stepped closer, his presence looming over her. "You're not the only one who's caught in this web," he said, his voice lower now, filled with something darker.
I've worked my whole life to build this empire, and I don't let people like you slip away.
"Not when you're this close." Lyra took another step back, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What do you mean by that?" Valerio didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out over the city below. The soft glow of the streetlights flickered in the distance, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world was outside their reach. "You're part of something bigger now, Lyra," Valerio said, his voice almost distant, as if he were talking to himself. "You've been pulled into this world, into my world, and there's no going back. You can fight it all you want, but in the end, you'll have to decide where your loyalty lies." Lyra stared at him, tried to process his words, but nothing made sense. She had thought this would be just another dinner, just another evening with a guest who would leave and never return. But she was wrong. Valerio de Luca was no ordinary guest. He was a force, a powerful man who could not be ignored. "I don't want to be part of your world," she repeated, though the conviction in her voice was starting to fade. Valerio turned to face her, his eyes piercing through her defenses. "You already are," he said softly. "And the more you try to deny it, the stronger the pull will be." Lyra felt trapped, cornered by her own feelings. She had been avoiding him, keeping her distance, but now it seemed like there was no escape. Valerio was everywhere, his presence looming over her even when he wasn't near. And the worst part was that a part of her didn't want to escape. A part of her wanted to know more, wanted to understand why she was so drawn to him. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. She didn't know how to argue with him, how to push him away when she was already so deeply caught in his web. Valerio took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're scared, Lyra. I can see it in your eyes. But the more you try to fight this, the more you'll lose." Lyra opened her mouth again, but this time she didn't say anything. She simply turned away, looking out the window as he had. Her thoughts were a mess, and she couldn't make sense of them. "I'm not like them," she whispered to herself. "I'm not like you." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if she believed them anymore.